Good morning. It's good to be with you this morning. Thank you for inviting me to speak. Thank you too. I know this church has supported CSW over quite a few years now. And thank you for the work that you do, Daphne, as our ambassador. And it's really, really good to be able to come up and spend a bit of time with you, just to talk a little bit about what's going on in the world and about what we do at CSW, but also about what you can do if you're not doing it already, because there are things that we can all do to participate. I just want to read a few verses actually from Hebrews chapter 11, if you don't mind, before I speak. Hebrews chapter 11 is the kind of chapter that talks about the heroes of the faith from the Old Testament. And the first part of the chapter goes into individual details of different men and women of faith, but the last few verses I'm going to read become a bit more general. So verse 32 says, "And what more shall I say? I don't have time to tell about Gideon and Barak, Samson and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again." Now I'm just going to pause there because the whole tone of these few verses changes after that. It says, others were tortured, refusing to be released so they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawn in two. That means they were beheaded. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, ill-treated. The world wasn't worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith. Yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. You notice there two completely different groups of people. It talks about people, all of these people were persecuted in some way. Of course, this is in the Old Testament, so they weren't Christians, but they were people who believed in our God, who were followers of our God, the one and only true God. But some of them were miraculously delivered from persecution. People you can think about, I'm sure, like Daniel in the lion's den, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the furnace. Incredibly delivered in a miraculous way. But there are others, it says there quite clearly, that weren't. Some of them had to go through torture. Some of them had to go through being beheaded. Some of them had to go through living in caves and holes in the ground. It talks about very difficult life. I don't know why there were two different groups. I don't know why God delivered some and didn't deliver others. Only God knows that. And there are some things in the Bible, aren't there? We just have to trust God. And maybe one day in eternity we'll know the answers to those things. But what I do want to stress is that it doesn't mean that those people like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego who were delivered had more faith than those that weren't, because it made it very clear at the end of that chapter that all of these people were commended for their faith. So there wasn't a group, if you like, a class A of followers of God and class B, and the class B got not delivered and the others got delivered. No, they were all commended for their faith. The point I want to make is that persecution of men and women of faith and men and women of God has been going on almost since the beginning of time. And of course, if you go into the New Testament, Jesus himself was persecuted, of course, to the point of death, that we might live. And in Matthew 24, Jesus said, "You'll be handed over to be persecuted and put to death. You'll be hated by all nations because of me." That's quite a staggering thing. And we are fortunate in this country that we aren't persecuted for what we believe. Now, I do often get asked the question, I must admit, what about persecution in this country? I want to make it clear there isn't persecution in this country. But I also want to point out that there is no doubt, we all know, that there are more and more cases of discrimination against Christians in this. It's not the same as persecution, but it could turn into persecution. Persecution rarely happens overnight. It's something that is progressive very often. And so we need to beware that that could happen, but there isn't persecution in this country per se. But, you know, Paul told Timothy in 2 Timothy 3 verse 12 that everyone who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. That's quite a statement, isn't it? As I say, we're fortunate that's not happening to us at the moment, but we need to be prepared for that, I guess. And so the point I'm making is that persecution has always been around. And of course, persecution in the early church was the norm. I sometimes go to churches and the pastor says to me, you know, we like to model ourselves on the early church in this church. Gary didn't say that to me this morning, but if he had done, I'd have probably said to him, well, if you really want to model yourself on the early church, you would be dead, mate. Because that's what happened to the leaders of the early church. They were martyred for their faith. All of Christ's disciples, all of Christ's apostles, apart from John and Judas Iscariot, were martyred for their faith. That was the norm. And it continues today. Persecution around the world is rife. Persecution, not just of Christians, but of others too. But Christians, without doubt, are the most persecuted group in the world. According to the Pew Foundation, or the Pew Forum, which is an American organization that does statistics on all kinds of things, but particularly on persecution. According to Pew, something like 80% of the world's population, I repeat that, 80% of the world's population live in countries with high or very high restrictions on religious freedom. That's staggering, isn't it? 80% of the world live in countries. Doesn't mean to say 80% of the world are persecuted. It means that they live in countries where there are restrictions. And the reason, I mean, some of the world's most populated or highest population countries like China and India, of course, are some of the worst for persecution. And so, and persecution continues to increase. When I started CSW, it was 45 years ago. And not far from here, actually, in South Essex, I come from originally, and we started CSW. It was, there wasn't much awareness of what was happening, and there is no doubt that it has continued to increase. And I can tell you this, that in the 20th century, in the last century, more Christians were persecuted for their faith than all the other centuries put together. But of course, one of the reasons for that is the Church of Jesus Christ is growing. Praise the Lord. Good, I think I heard that, yeah. Sorry, I'm from a Pentecostal church, so I'm used to a bit more. Hallelujah, the Church of Jesus Christ is growing. Because Jesus said, that's better. Because Jesus said, I will build my church. Okay, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. I can tell you this, you know, and the church is growing, actually, very often the fastest in countries with the greatest persecution. Does anybody any idea where what country has got the fastest growing church? China. You got them both. China and Iran. Iran probably is the country, they say now, that's got the fastest growing church. And Iran is an Islamic theocracy. It's amazing. China, which probably has got was the fastest growing church until a few years ago, probably got 130 million believers in China. That's incredible. Probably 10% of the population of China are Christian, and that's amidst the worst persecution. I'll tell you a bit about that later. So, you know, the reason persecution is growing very often is because the church is growing too. And let me tell you some statistics. I went to Nepal last year, and I happen to know that Nepal is a Hindu country, incidentally. So, and I happen to know that in 1960, there were just 50 Christians in Nepal, okay? Just 50. And none of them were Nepalis. All of them were from outside, some from Britain, some from India, other places. And they were teachers and nurses and doctors, people who'd gone in there professionally, but to preach the gospel too. It's 50 people in 1960. By 1990, those 50 had increased to 50,000. Which was amazing. But when I was in Nepal last year, I noticed crosses everywhere. Wherever you went in the Himalayas and in the country of Nepal, I found crosses. And I said to one of the pastors, I said, how big is the church in Nepal now? 2 million. 2 million believers. Yes. Amen. It's worth applauding for, isn't it? Because Jesus Christ said, I will build my church. And you know, I told those statistics in a church not that long ago, actually. And after the service, this is amazing, a little old lady came up to me and she said, oh, I'm so glad you said that. She said, I was one of the 50. I was a nurse that went into Nepal in 1960. What a legacy. And we never know, do we, as Christians? We never know when we plant a seed. We never know how it might grow. But that's what's happened in Nepal. So I tell you that to encourage you this morning, that the church is growing despite persecution. But nevertheless, I want to look at persecution this morning. And first of all, just let me tell you what CSW does. In this world of persecution that we face, this world where 80% of people live in countries with high or very high restrictions. What we do at CSW, we're not an aid organisation. We don't deliver Bibles. We don't do any of the mission type work. In fact, we have got an anti-proselytisation policy at CSW. We do not proselytise. That doesn't mean, and of course, as an individual, I'm called to preach the gospel. That's the Great Commission that we've all been given. But as an organisation, we don't do that, and there's a reason for that. The reason is because we speak up for people of all faiths, and I'll come to that in a second. But nevertheless, I've lost my train of thought for a second. Why? Oh yes, why we are. Why? We are not a proselytation organisation, but we want to make the world a place where the gospel of Jesus Christ can be preached. Okay, so we enable others, mission organisations, to preach the gospel because we try to get laws changed. We try to get countries to accept that freedom of religion or belief is an important thing, and it certainly is in this dangerous world. We live in a really dangerous world, and I'm sure I don't need to tell you that at the moment. And freedom of religion or belief is actually one of the keys to peace and stability for people for all faiths to be able. Because what I think we don't realise very often in the West is that most of the world are religious. Okay, I'm not talking about just Christians. Most of the world are religious. People often say to me, when I tell them what I do, people often say to me, oh, well, religion's the cause of all the problems in the world. And I understand why they say that, but they say that out of ignorance of the fact that the world is religious. And when you're deeply religious, whatever religion that is, it impacts everything. It impacts the way you live. It impacts who you marry. It impacts the way you invest. All kinds of things. And so we need to turn that narrative around from that religion is the cause of all the problems to freedom of religion actually is one of the solutions to the problems in the world today. And that's what we try to do at CSW. Let me say, I did say, so what we do, we are an advocacy organisation. We work in Parliament in Britain, we work at the EU, we work at the United Nations. We've got status at the United Nations in the Human Rights Council. We work on Capitol Hill. In fact, I've just come back from 2 days in Washington this week. It's an interesting place to be at the moment. But we provide a voice for those that are persecuted into the corridors of power. And you know, it's amazing. When I started this work in 1979, when I went to Parliament to try to find people interested in this subject, I found just 3 MPs. That's all I could find that were interested. Today, or just before the general election, because things go back to 0 after the election, but there was an all-party parliamentary group that had 170 members for religious freedom and for freedom of religion or belief. That's staggering for people, 170 members of both houses of Parliament and all parties too. So that was amazing. There's been a real change, a shift. There's been a political awareness. But of course the situation is as bad as it's ever been, if not worse. But because there is that political awareness, I believe that there are all kinds of institutions being set up. There's something called the International Religious Freedom and Belief Alliance of 42 countries meeting together. I'm privileged to sit on their panel of experts, but they meet together regularly to discuss how we can promote and produce freedom of religion or belief around the world. When we started, it was all about, in 1979, it was all about persecution it's all about Christian persecution in the old Soviet bloc, the old Eastern Europe. So countries like Russia, Romania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, all of those countries where Christians were persecuted. We started off in response to that, and we would campaign for individual Christians who were persecuted to see them released. That's how we started. And of course, in 1989, if you know anything about history or remember, in 1989, communism fell throughout Europe, and suddenly, overnight, Christians were free to practice again. And that has continued in most of those countries. Some of them are going backwards at the moment. But nevertheless, we had to look around in 1989 and think, well, is there any more persecution? We only knew about persecution in Eastern Europe. And suddenly we found out, wow, there was many more places where Christians were persecuted. And so we continued our work, because I wondered if we needed to stop. I thought perhaps this was the end. God had answered our prayers and that was the end, but it wasn't. And then as we looked around and saw, I think it was about 20 years ago, one of my staff members came to me and said, look, she'd just come back from Burma, and we were writing a report on persecution of Christians in Burma. And she said to me, look, I know I'm doing this report on the persecution of Christians in Burma, but there's a group of Muslims who are just as badly persecuted called the Rohingya. And nobody had heard of the Rohingya then, but now most people have. But she said, what should we do about that? And of course we need to speak up about persecution of anybody. You know, God has given us all a free will. We're all made in the image of God, but he gave us a free will to choose. We don't have to choose Jesus. We can choose other ways, but God is a God of justice. He hates injustice. So for anybody to be persecuted for what they believe, I believe is wrong. And so and it was a big step actually, because a lot of Christians didn't quite understand that. I hope you do here, but it's important that we speak up for people of other faiths. Listen, I believe that Jesus Christ is the only way to God the Father. Let me get that out of the way, okay, in case you think I'm some kind of syncretist. No, I'm not. I believe that Jesus Christ is the only way, but I also believe that, you know, if 2 people walked into this church this morning hungry, one of them was a Muslim and one of them was a Christian, would you only feed the Christian? Pardon? No. Praise God. I hope that's the case. Of course it's the case. And so it's the same way. And it's very powerful. When we speak up for the Rohingya Muslims, or we speak up for the Uyghur Muslims in China, or we speak up for the Yazidis in Iraq who have had genocide committed against them, when we speak up for them, that's being missional, you know. People say, why would you do that? We do that because we're Christians. We do that because I believe that's what Jesus would do, to speak up for those that are oppressed, whether or not they're like us. When Jesus was asked, who is my neighbour? He told the story of the Good Samaritan. And that was basically saying to the man who asked Jesus, who's my neighbour, I think he was hoping for a list of a few people he could tick off. Jesus basically said, everybody. The whole world is your neighbour, but especially those that we don't like or get on with. And so that's what we do in CSW. We speak up. We are Christian through and through, and we do that as Christians, but we speak up for all groups. So where is it happening in the world? Unless you've got a week, I haven't got time to go through the places where Christians are persecuted. But, you know, we focus on about 30 countries. We could focus on at least double that number if we had the resources to. But we focus on about 30 countries. The worst country in the world for violence against religious minorities, so this is against Christians and in this case Muslims too. The worst, anybody idea the worst country for violence against Christians? Actually, you're probably right, although the figures at the moment say India. But Nigeria is very, very quickly overtaking them. But India is in the latest Pew figures. It says that India has got the worst country. So violence against Christians and against Muslims, and this is fueled by something called Hindutva, which is a Hindu philosophy espoused by the BJP government in India, and especially by Mr. Modi and the Prime Minister. And that says basically to be if you're going to be a good Indian citizen, you're going to be a good Hindu. And if you're going to be a good Hindu, you need to basically get rid of the other religions. And so attacks on Christian churches and on Muslim mosques and Muslim and Christian areas are prevalent. And the government basically turns a blind eye to that happening. So India, we'll come back to Nigeria in a minute actually. Traditionally, one of the worst countries in the world, I mean, we've already talked about it briefly, is China. And let me say communist countries generally. I talked about just now the old Eastern Bloc countries were communist countries, and still any communist countries, and there aren't that many of them left, but places like Vietnam and Laos, but Cuba too. I'll mention Cuba before I finish. But China is a communist country that represses Christians really badly. And in fact, people of any faith, basically. And it's quite well known that there are something like 3 million Uyghur Muslims in re-education camps at the moment. That's a story that actually has got some traction on the news. We broke that story, actually. But about up to 3 million of them in re-education camps, simply because they are Uyghurs. And most of the Uyghurs are Muslims, and there are some Christian Muslims too. Some Christian Uyghurs too. But it's not just the Uyghurs that are being persecuted in China. Basically, it's all groups. And in fact, if I'd have been standing here maybe 12 years ago, 14 years ago, I'd have been telling you that things were getting better in China. But they've got since Xi Jinping has come to power, they've got progressively worse. And most China watchers would say that the situation for Christians and people of faith in China is the worst that it's been since the Cultural Revolution. So it's pretty bad in China. And yet, as we've just said, the church is growing. We can thank God for that. And you know, basically the church, I talked about 130 million. Basically, most of those 130 million are in what we call underground churches, family churches, churches that are not registered. The reason they're not registered is because they feel that when they're registered, they get they're watched by the government, and so they don't register. There are a group of churches, quite a few churches, that try to register and can't get registered. And then there are official churches. So the official churches in China are called, the Protestant churches are called the Three Self-Patriotic Movement. Now, more and more, and the government, or the Chinese Communist Party, says that we allow religion because we allow the Three Self-Patriotic Movement to exist. but of course it's under strict control. But let me tell you this one small fact about the churches, even the official churches in China. If this was an official Three Self church this morning here, there will be cameras all around this auditorium. There would have been cameras as you came in the front doors. And these cameras are not just ordinary cameras, they're face recognition cameras. So when you come in, the government knows that you've entered the church. The government knows because they've got your photo on your identity cards, and that's government. So if you come into the church, the government knows you've come. You say, well, that's not a problem because it's an official church. We're allowed. But let me tell you, there are 5 groups of people who are not even allowed to go into an official church. If you're a member of the Communist Party, if you are a government employee, if you're a member of the armed forces, if you are a student at university, or if you're a minor under the age of 18, you're forbidden to enter those churches. And so the minute you come into the church, you're seen, you're watched, and you can be followed, you can be interrogated. It depends. That's the control that the state has in China. And now they tell me, just recently I've heard they've now got cameras that can, if they miss your face as you come in the church, they can get you as you walk away, because they've got cameras that actually can tell who you are by your gait, by the way that you walk from behind. They can identify you. That's staggering. And you know, AI is a double-edged sword. AI is a fantastic opportunity for Christians and for others, but it's also an incredible, incredible danger. And I've just come back from a conference in Berlin a few weeks ago where we were talking about AI and freedom of religion or belief, and how that in places like Pakistan, for example, where people are accused of blasphemy, wrongly accused of blasphemy, what they can now do with AI is they can take a video of you and they can put words into your mouth, basically, saying things that you're not saying. So that can be used more and more against people who are accused of blasphemy. I have at times really running out. I'm sorry. I need to finish, but what can we do about this? I've told you where we work as CSW. We write reports. We raise these. You know, I sit, for example, on the Foreign Secretary's Human Rights Advisory Group, and the Foreign Secretary, when Jeremy Hunt was the Foreign Secretary a few years ago, he called for a review of persecution of Christians all around the world, and that was a great thing. And we've got something called the Truro Review, which has got 22 recommendations for how our government can speak out against freedom of religion or belief. That's fantastic, but we need to pray. Prayer is the most important thing we can do. Okay. Prayer is the most, and I hope I've got some literature outside which has got our website on, csw.org.uk. If you go onto our website, you can find out how you can pray. Prayer is the most important thing you can do. Second thing you can do is protest. And again, on our website, we give opportunities for you to write to your Member of Parliament, for you to write to ambassadors or presidents of other countries. And, you know, these things do make a difference. I can tell you that. If thousands of people, if you write to your MP, for example, that we need more awareness. We've got 351 new MPs in Parliament. Half of my life is spent in building relationships with members of Parliament, and half of those people I built relationships with disappeared on July the 4th. And so we're building new relationships. But pray that, and please do write to your MP. And we've got letters, sample letters on our website where you can do that. So you can pray, you can protest, you can provide. And thank you for providing financially for our organisation here in this church. I really appreciate that. And we couldn't do our work without that. But we desperately need more resources to raise these issues in more countries. But you can also provide, you know, by writing letters and cards of encouragement to people in prison and people who are fighting for human rights. And I think you already do that, Daphne, in the church. But it's really, really important, more people to do it. It's a very easy thing to do. Christmas is coming up. Send a Christmas card to somebody. We've got a resource on the table out there. I've got a resource called Connect and Encourage. And basically, it's an address book where you can sit down and you can write a few cards. They make make a difference. I've met people that have received these cards, and they can tell you what a difference it's made. People in prison that have received cards, and not all cards get through, but even if they don't get through, the prison authorities suddenly know they're getting hundreds of cards coming in. They know, actually, people in the world know about this person. We need to treat them carefully. And so that's another way you can provide. And the fourth P, so we've talked about prayer, provision, and protest, but also we can proclaim this. We can tell other people. People have got no idea what's going on in the world. We mentioned Nigeria. Let me tell you, what's happening in Nigeria is horrendous. I don't know if you know about the young girl called Leah Sharibu. You do know about her, but let me just, those of you who don't, Leah was a 14-year-old schoolgirl who was taken by Boko Haram, kidnapped a few years ago, and together with 109 other Christian schoolgirls, they were taken, and the government negotiated their release. They've been kidnapped, and they released them all apart from one, Leah Sharibu. She was the only Christian. The other were Muslim girls, and they said that she could go provided she converted to Islam first. 14 years old, she refused to convert. Can you imagine that? If we're all honest, none of us know what we would have done in that situation. I think, if you're honest, no matter how strong a Christian you are today, I think if we're honest with ourselves, would we have made that same decision as Leah? We might have said, well, I can pretend to convert. And I'm not saying that would have been wrong, actually. But Leah refused to. She was 14. She's now 21, and she's still being held captive by Boko Haram. We need to pray for people like Leah. But she's just one case, and there are hundreds and indeed thousands of similar cases of people being kidnapped, people being killed, whole villages, whole Christian villages being destroyed in Nigeria. We can pray, we can protest, and we can tell others about this. I'm going to finish by just reading a very, very short extract from a book that was written by a man called Erwin Lutzer, who was a pastor, who was a young boy, rather, in Nazi Germany. And this is what he wrote this as an old man living in America, but this is what he said. A railroad track ran behind our small church, and each Sunday morning we could hear the whistle in the distance, and then the wheels coming over the tracks. We became disturbed when we heard the cries coming from the train as it passed by. We realised that it was carrying Jews like cattle in the cars. Week after week, the whistle would blow. We dreaded to hear the sound of those wheels because we knew that we'd also hear the cries of the Jews en route to death camp. Their screams tormented us. We knew the time the train was coming, and when we heard the whistle blow, we began singing hymns. By the time the train came past our church, we were singing at the tops of our voices. If we heard the screams, we simply sang more loudly until we heard them no more. Although years have passed, I still hear the train whistle in my sleep. God forgive me. God forgive all of us who called ourselves Christians and yet did nothing to intervene. There are things that we can do to intervene. I've just outlined some of them, and I'll very briefly say, just before I step down, I have on the table out there a petition for a Cuban pastor in prison at the moment called Pastor Lorenzo. I'd love you to sign that, please, if you can, before you go. And also there's an opportunity there where you can receive ongoing prayer information about the work that we're doing. So thank you very much indeed, and God bless you all.